Welcome to this episode of The Compressor Guru. We're not going to tear anything apart today. We're not going to put anything together today. But we're going to make my life easier. I get phone calls every day, folks. And these phone calls, a guy will tell me, this is a really common one. A guy will tell me, hey, the regulator that shuts my compressor down is going bad. Okay, so it's a gasoline engine or diesel engine? No, it's electric. Folks, this is a pressure switch. This is not a regulator. So what we're going to do today, we're going to go over some glossary terms because communications is essential. And if I have to spend a whole bunch of time figuring out what you're talking about, I'll do that, but it's easier if we're both on the same page when we start. So this is not an electric regulator. This is a pressure switch, and there's a pressure switch basically on every compressor that has an electric motor. So we'll get back to this. When we talk about air, one of the most common things we will use when we're talking about the size or performance of a compressor is CFM. CFM is an acronym, and it is cubic feet per minute. And that is a measure of volume that the compressor will put out. Now, CFM doesn't mean anything unless you put it with PSI, which in the last episode we talked about PSI being pounds per square inch. Pounds per square inch is, why does 30 pounds of air in a tire in a car hold up a car? That car weighs, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pounds. It's because every square inch has that 30 pounds on inside that tire, and the cumulative square inches inside the tire and wheel give you that strength to hold that car up. So PSI, pounds per square inch, do not confuse pounds per square inch with total pounds, because it's not. So when we talk about CFM and PSI, what a normal rating might be would be 17.5 CFM at 150 PSI. And that's probably about what the rating is on these new Atlas Copcos we've been selling. I had to have to read it to make sure. By the way, I did not get LASIK surgery. We're shooting in my office. I'm standing in the customer area today, and the lighting isn't good enough. You can't see anything except the reflections off my glasses. So no, the Guru and Bud did not get LASIK surgery. We're shooting this blind because I can't see anything. Anyway, so CFM and PSI are normally measured together, and it's the actual performance of a compressor. It could be we're just going to leave it at that. It's the actual performance of the compressor. Now, one of the things that in common terminology, guys will call and say, hey, the head on my compressor is bad. And I don't normally use the word head, but a lot of people refer to the compressor pump as the head. Now, the reason I mention this is because it gets a little confusing. When I hear head, I think of the area above the cylinder where your valves are. So that's what I think of as a head, but the word head is actually normal terminology for the compressor pump. You'll hear me referring to it as the pump. So you can say head, and I do have a clue what you mean, but it's so much simpler if you are specific with me and going, it's the compressor pump or the head where the valves are, because because. No. Anyway, the compressor head is normal terminology for the pump. And it's also part of the compressor. The compressor has a head, and that's the area above the cylinder. The next term, demand. And I think the best way to describe demand is how much air you need in your shop. If you have a sandblaster, the consumption or demand of that sandblaster might be 30 CFM at 90 PSI. So, you know, if we're talking, or if you're talking to somebody like me, and you go, the demand is 30 CFM at 90 PSI, or that tool or that unit consumes 30 CFM at 90 PSI. So demand or consumption is something you want to use in terminology, but some of this stuff we're talking about today isn't just about, well, how do we talk to the guru or how do we explain it to Bud, but it is, I want you to be able to be thinking about why certain things work together the way they do. You know, that's why I explained the tire already. One of the most misused words when talking about air systems is a dryer. Guys will call me and say, hey Bud, I got a dryer but it's not taking enough water out. Oh, what kind of dryer is it? Is it a desiccant or is it a refrigerated dryer? And how long's it been since you changed your beads, or how old is the dryer itself? And they'll go, what beads? What? It's been on there 10 years, but I don't. And I go, okay, is it a dryer or is it a filter or is it a trap? And so many folks will have a little air filter, and I'll put a picture up. So many folks have a little air filter and they'll go, that's a dryer. And it might be a filter that is either has an element in it, or maybe it's a coalescing filter, but it is simply a filter. A dryer is a device that is, there's two popular kinds. One is a desiccant dryer, and the other is a refrigerated air dryer. And a desiccant dryer has these little absorbent beads that will chemically capture moisture that's in compressed air. The other kind of dryer is a refrigerated air dryer, where it works like your refrigerator, except it doesn't cool a massive amount of air. It cools the air in the pipe that's going through the dryer. When that air is cooled, it condenses the water into a liquid instead of a vapor, and is caught in a trap or a filter after the dryer. And then what proceeds beyond the filter or trap is fairly dry air. So you can see by what I'm explaining here, a filter is not a dryer. Another thing that will help remove a large amount of moisture from your air is an aftercooler. And there's a lot of aftercooler videos on YouTube. We do sell aftercoolers. A customer of mine in Georgia recently put on one on his compressor, and ours are sized at 75 CFM. An air-cooled aftercooler is another great way to remove a lot of moisture from air, and there's a lot of them being shown on the internet. Guys are buying transmission coolers that may or may not be sized the proper size for the compressor, but an air-cooled aftercooler, a properly sized air-cooled aftercooler, will take about 90% of the humidity out of compressed air before it goes downstream to your point of use. So an air-cooled aftercooler is a very good way to get rid of most of your moisture. It might not be good enough for a body shop where you're spraying $200 a gallon paint. That's when you add the dryer after the aftercooler. But we can go through the process of getting your air dry. Horsepower. The horsepower of a compressor can be very misleading. We put an episode up, how to choose your compressor, around Christmas 2020 when the episode went up. And horsepower is a very funny thing depending on whether it's an industrial motor or a commercial duty motor, or whether it's a gasoline or diesel engine. A 13 horse Honda engine is more or less equivalent to a 5 to 7 horse electric motor, industrial motor. So you go to the big box store and you have the a 2-stage compressor, and it's got a 6 horsepower motor, and you look at the performance and it says the performance is 12 CFM at 90 PSI. Well, that doesn't make sense, because there's a 5 horse compressor out here in the shop that's making 17.5 CFM at 150 PSI. So the motor horsepower, although it's a guide for you, doesn't necessarily mean that's how you want to size your stuff, because that doesn't necessarily mean it's how you want to size your compressor, because you want to consider how much air you need. Not I'm buying a 5 horsepower compressor, because your motors are so strangely rated depending on industrial, commercial, or whether it's gasoline. They're all rated differently. And now the definition of a horsepower is the amount of energy needed to move 550 pounds 1 foot in 1 second. And that isn't what a horse does. So don't be misled when looking at compressors and look at horsepower and think that that's because the 6 is a better machine than the 5 horse. Because if it's a commercial duty motor, it's not rated the same, and you can see that in the delivery specs on the compressors. A couple more terms let's just hit the highlights of is a piston or a recip compressor. That's a recip compressor is simply one that uses pistons to move the air. A screw compressor, where you would have 2 gears that are so beautifully meshed together that they will actually push air. My wife, the camera wife, brought up another one, a rotary compressor, which basically has a larger armature where vanes slide out of the armature and run inside of an eccentric like inside of an air tool. Instead of being an air motor, they actually are an air compressor. So that's the highlights of a couple different types of compressors. While we're talking about the recip compressor, there's 2 basic types, single stage and 2-stage. Your single stage compressor is usually good for about 125 pounds. If it has more than 1 piston, the pistons are all the same size, and it's a very simple pump. Your 2-stage compressor is still a simple machine, but you'll have at least 2 pistons, and there'll be different sizes. The large piston will be the low pressure piston, and the small piston will be the high pressure piston, and they're connected by a cooler. And so your single stage is good for about 125. Your 2-stage is usually good for about 175. Now they do make 3-stage compressors that are used for things like scuba gear and fireman equipment, but I've never worked on one of those. But single and 2-stage is a normal thing for your shop compressors, for your industrial compressors. Friends, there's a lot more glossary terms I could just touch on here, but I'm not going to. In the description, I'm going to put a link to glossary terms for air compressors. And we're going to follow this episode up with another episode about the brass valves and the terminology to different brass valves and pressure switches. This is a pressure switch. We're going to follow this episode up with another episode about brass valves, what they are, how they work, and where they go. So, like, subscribe, comment, appreciate your input. And friends, have a great day. God bless. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Compressor Guru. Please hit like and subscribe and use the notify bell so you will know when the next new episode is released from The Compressor Guru. God bless you and have a great day.